Hello, team. Okay, so let's talk about homework for tonight. You're going to do question number 10 on your reading guide. And yes, I know we've skipped some. We're going to go back. We're going to make it happen. The reason we're doing them in this order is so that we can kind of group things together and talk about the similarities and differences in types of research. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about descriptive research, and this is a very specific group of the types of research that we've talked about before, and it achieves certain goals. So just like the types of research themselves, it's good for some things, not good for other things. Okay. And then aside from doing question number 10 tonight in your reading guide, you're also going to design your own survey, and we'll talk about what that looks like, and how to do that when we get there. All right, so go ahead and set up your notes. You can see I started leaving the date blank so that we can, just kind of put these wherever. We're still in our scientific foundations unit, and today we're talking about descriptive research. Okay, so basically descriptive research means that we're not using numbers to figure stuff out. So we are not looking at correlation. We're not looking at the amount of people who do or don't do a thing. We're not looking at test scores, things like that. So in descriptive research, when we say data, that means observations. So I'll give you an example of that. If I was going to use descriptive research about teaching, one of the things I might do is, talk about my observations. So observing this many people out of this many people are on task, or observing that this many people turned in their assignment, or observing that this person always asks a question right away instead of trying it themselves first, right? So things that I can look at, observe. It's not a judgment. It's not my own thought about the thing. It's simply like what I can see when I'm looking at their answers to the survey questions or when I'm watching people. All right, so some of these types of research we've discussed a little bit before, but we're going to go more in depth so that we can talk about why they're descriptive. So our first one is naturalistic observation. So a reminder, this is when we are just watching behavior. There's a key component to this that we haven't discussed yet, though, which is that the person who's observing does not get involved. They do not enter into a conversation, an agreement, an argument, anything like that. They don't do anything to change the environment. Basically, the goal is to be invisible. All right. So a benefit of this is that it allows us to be in more natural spaces, right? So we can observe people in offices, we can observe people on the subway, we can observe people at home, right? So we're not in a lab, and we can get kind of more like how people would really behave instead of being in a lab and feeling like they want to do the right thing or whatever. The problem with this, as I'm sure you've guessed, is that it's super, super difficult for people to watch others without them knowing they're being watched, right? So if I'm standing at the front of the classroom, that I'm watching you, right? I'm looking at you and figuring out what you're doing, what you're not doing. But it's easier to kind of watch people, especially in bigger crowds, but it's really, really hard to observe somebody without them eventually realizing that you're observing them, or without kind of getting involved. So a famous example of this from history would be Jane Goodall. You might not know who she is, but she's an anthropologist. She's awesome. And she lived with chimpanzees for a really long time. So she was doing naturalistic observation because they were in their environment, their normal environment, but she also was really involved with them, so she wasn't necessarily like following that tenet of it. All right. So another form of descriptive research that we've talked about is a case study. A reminder that this is when we look at a person or a small group in depth, so literally everything about them. So we might conduct interviews with that person and the people around them that they're involved in with, especially loved ones. We might do some psychological testing. So an example of this would be like if somebody wanted to do a case study of me, they would look at my school records, they would interview Miss Manaya, they would interview other teachers here at school, they would interview my husband, my sister, my parents. They would look at how I interact with my dog, like all kinds of stuff. You really are trying to get a whole complete picture of this person or this small group. And usually researchers look at a lot of case studies together if they want to figure out a pattern. So when we look at one case study, we cannot generalize to the population because not everybody is like that case study, right? So again, going back to our example, if somebody does a case study about me, well, I'm white, so what applies to me might not apply to people of color, right? Because I have white privilege. So you can't generalize from that. Or I'm a woman, so what you find from my case study might not apply to men. And I'm an adult, so what you find from my case study might not apply to kids, right? Or to even older people. So you can't take one case study and treat that as though you can apply it to all people. But what you can do is gather a ton of case studies together and look for patterns in those that you can maybe apply to the bigger population. So one example of this is Kitty Genovese, and we're going to talk about her in depth later in the year, but basically Kitty was murdered right outside her front door. A bunch of her neighbors were home. Only one or two people called the cops. Nobody went out to help her. It was pretty gruesome. And so when we look at her case study along with other murders, especially unsolved murders, we might find patterns, right? Or we might find some statistics that help us figure out, like, oh, crime, there's this particular kind of crime in this particular area, or this particular type of crime is more likely to happen to women, okay? We also use surveys when we're doing descriptive research. So you guys know what a survey is. You answer some questions, maybe it's even an in-person interview, and it can be pretty much about anything, what you believe, how you feel, your background, what you would do in a certain situation. So again, just like with case studies, we need a lot of these in order to find a pattern. I mean, tons and tons and tons of answers. But the biggest problem with this is that because whoever is participating in the survey is giving their own answer, it's not an observable behavior. They might lie. They might not completely answer the question. They might leave stuff out. They might not understand what the question is asking, and so give an answer that isn't useful or accurate. So an example of this would be from the 2016 election. So when they were taking polls leading up to the election, it looked like Clinton was going to win in a landslide, right? There was almost no doubt in anybody's mind that she was going to win. Trump was not going to win. All the polls were saying she had a huge, huge chance of winning, like in the 90s. And when it came to election day, we all know what happened, right? The reason for this is because in these surveys, these polls, people were lying. People were not saying that they were going to vote for Trump when that's who they voted for, right? They were saying they were going to vote for Clinton because it made them sound like a better person. And people have all sorts of reasons for lying. That's just one example, all right? I might lie on a survey because I'm embarrassed to admit something. I might lie because I feel like it's not their business. I might lie because I actually don't know the truth, right? There's all types of things that can happen. So these are not really as reliable as something like naturalistic observation or a case study. All right, so I want to go a little bit further into the surveys or to descriptive research, excuse me, because there are good things and bad things about it. So the good thing is that, like we've been saying, it can look at questions that experiments can't, because you can see people in their natural environment and you can talk directly to the people. They're not as controlled, right? So you can explore things that you may not be able to do in a lab. But there are a lot of disadvantages. You cannot control the environment or the subject enough in order to figure out cause and effect. At best, you're going to get a correlation, at best, okay? They're almost impossible to replicate. So if I'm doing naturalistic observation of the subway car I'm on, it's pretty likely that I'm never going to be on that car at that time with that exact same group of people ever again, right? I might see the same people because you have like commute buddies, but it's never going to be exactly the same mix. And people are going to have different emotional states. And like we talked about before, your findings don't always generalize. So you may have done all of this work and then you can't really apply it to the general population because of the nature of the work. Okay, so your assignment for today is to design your own survey. And this can be about anything you want. When you get to the assignments box, you're just going to type it right in that box there. If you find that doesn't give you enough room, you can create a Google Doc and type it there. And then, as usual, you copy the link to the URL for the Google Doc, and you put that in the box in iLearn for the submission. So I want you to answer 3 questions for me. I want to know what you want to find out. So it could be anything from what type of college experience do my classmates want to, what type of things do people do in their spare time, to it can literally, or how do people feel about the abortion, the new Supreme Court nomination, how do people feel about Trump? It can literally be anything that you want. So what do you want to find out? Then who's your target population? And you need to be really, really careful here. You need to include gender, age, race, etc. All right. So if you want to find out what type of college experience people want, your target population is going to be 16, 18-year-olds, people who are getting ready to go to college. It's not going to be 24-year-olds because many of them have already been to college and are done, right? That question doesn't apply to them. And then I want you to draft the questions that you're going to ask. So what questions would you actually put on your survey? And like we talked about before, you need to be really, really, really careful about how you word these questions so that you're not influencing the answers that people give you. So, for example, if I asked you, how much time do you have to spend on homework every night versus how much time you get to spend on homework every night, your answer might be different. Because if you said, I have to spend 4 hours because that's all the assignments that I have and that's how long they're going to take, but I get to spend 2 hours because I have to give my little brother his bath and put him to bed because my mom works the night shift, right? So they're different. Those are 2 completely different answers to a question that seems like it's the same. So you just want to be careful there. Text me, let me know if you have any problems.